Flight attendant denies black girl first class, unaware her father owns the airline. A young girl, wide-eyed with excitement, steps into the world of first class for the first time, a well-earned experience made possible by her mother's hard work. But the moment she takes her seat, a flight attendant, blinded by her own assumptions, decides she doesn't belong. The questions come first, then the quiet skepticism, until the confrontation escalates beyond anything she expected. What happens when a person in power believes they can decide who is worthy of privilege? And what happens when they realize they've made a mistake that could cost them everything? This is a gripping story of perception, bias, and the consequences of underestimating the wrong passenger. At 30,000 feet, a lesson will be learned, but not by the one who was meant to be put in her place. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe that respect should never be a privilege, but a right, hit the like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge perspectives and inspire change. Your support helps these powerful stories reach more people. Now let's get into it. New York's early morning sky was draped in a thin veil of mist that lent everything a subdued, ghostly glow. The airport terminal bustled with travelers clutching carry-on bags, coffee cups, and the occasional folded newspaper. In the midst of this motion stood 9-year-old Aniyah and her mother Cynthia, both bundled in warm coats to ward off the late winter chill. This morning was unlike any other for them. Today, they were flying first class for the very first time. It wasn't a casual choice or a last-minute splurge. It was the result of months of Cynthia's careful budgeting, saving, and sacrificing small luxuries so she could give her daughter an experience she hoped would be both memorable and inspiring. Aniyah clutched her boarding pass in one hand and the sleeve of her mother's coat in the other. Despite the cold that reddened her cheeks, she radiated a quiet excitement. The terminal lights overhead reflected in her wide eyes, revealing a mix of curiosity and a hint of awe. It felt surreal to her to be standing in a priority check-in line, watching business travelers and seasoned flyers move seamlessly through the process. A passing thought flitted through her mind. Would anyone notice she was just a little girl who had never done this before? Cynthia, carefully balancing her purse and a neatly packed carry-on, exhaled a determined breath as the queue advanced. She had worked a second job for 6 months to afford this trip. It wasn't meant to be a grand vacation to an exotic island or a lavish tour of Europe. It was simply a short flight from New York to Los Angeles. But the significance of sitting in first class went beyond legroom or complimentary beverages. To Cynthia, it represented a moment of pride, of showing her daughter that with perseverance, doors once thought closed might open, at least a little. When they finally reached the check-in counter, the airline representative welcomed them politely. Cynthia offered a practiced smile, handed over the tickets, and checked the meticulously organized documents she kept in a small folder. The representative confirmed their seats, told them to proceed to security, and wished them a pleasant flight. It was all so ordinary yet exhilarating for Aniyah, who had grown used to hearing her classmates boast about their fancy vacations or their well-traveled parents. For the first time, she felt like maybe she had a story of her own, one where she could say she sat at the front of the plane and got served breakfast on real plates. They navigated the security checkpoint, which was mercifully less crowded than on a typical Monday. Cynthia guided Aniyah to a nearby seating area so they could slip their coats off and gather themselves before heading to the gate. Aniyah's breath quickened with anticipation. She looked around at the rows of seats filled with passengers eating pastries or typing on laptops, each seemingly in their own world. In the distance, large windows revealed the tarmac, where airplanes taxied and lined up for takeoff. A wave of excitement rushed over her at the sight of the aircraft, her aircraft, waiting for them. The mother and daughter made their way to the gate, where a digital sign read, "Flight 327 to Los Angeles." Overhead, announcements reminded travelers of boarding times. Aniyah noticed some people wore sleek suits or fashionable jackets and carried designer luggage, while others wore sweatpants and baseball caps. She glanced down at her own outfit, jeans, sneakers and a warm sweater, and wondered whether she looked out of place in the first-class line. Before she could dwell too much on that, Cynthia gently nudged her forward as the boarding call began for premium passengers. Walking through the jet bridge felt almost magical to Aniyah. The hum of the airplane's ventilation system, the distant rumble of engines, the excited chatter of fellow passengers. She was taking it all in, like it was the most extraordinary concert of everyday life. When they finally stepped through the aircraft door, she caught the distinct scent of new upholstery mixed with circulating cabin air, a smell she would forever associate with this moment of wonder. A flight attendant, with a cordial smile, stood by the entrance, greeting them briefly as they handed over their tickets. For Aniyah, it was yet another thrill to see the professional attire, the neatly tied scarf and the polished name tag glinting under the cabin lights. They were pointed down the aisle toward the first-class section, and Aniyah did her best to contain the giddy feeling that swirled inside her. Up ahead, the aisle branched into a luxurious row of wide seats upholstered in soft leather, each equipped with extra legroom and personal monitors. Cynthia helped Aniyah stow her small backpack in the overhead bin. The seat felt plush beneath her, like sinking into a cloud. She buckled her seatbelt and turned her attention to the window. The view wasn't much yet, just another jet parked nearby and the faint edges of airport buildings, but she was awed by the sense that soon they'd be slicing through the sky. Cynthia settled in beside her, smoothing out her skirt and checking the small tote that contained their essential items. She quietly reminded Aniyah to be mindful of airplane etiquette, although she couldn't hide her own excitement peeking through her calm exterior. As they settled, Aniyah thought about her father, Marcus. She remembered him saying something about a late-night meeting that might delay his travel plans. He had intended to join them, but she didn't know if he'd make it on time. Her mother's phone had been silent all morning, which likely meant he was still tied up at work. Aniyah felt a little pang of disappointment that he wouldn't be there to share in this first experience, but she knew he was busy with important things. He was, after all, part of the reason they could afford a life with steady opportunities. Even if money was still tight most of the time, she felt hopeful that maybe he'd catch a later flight and surprise them in California. Cynthia clasped Aniyah's hand for a brief moment, giving it a reassuring squeeze. It was her silent way of saying, "We've made it this far, let's enjoy what we've earned." The plane's interior lighting shone softly, bathing everything in a warm glow. A few rows ahead, an older gentleman settled in, tipping his hat politely as he noticed Cynthia and Aniyah. To their left, a woman rummaged in her designer purse, occasionally throwing curious glances at them, but offering a polite nod when their eyes met. Aniyah took a moment to explore the small seat pocket in front of her, examining the in-flight magazine and safety card. Everything felt so new. The seat controls, the footrest, the screen that was bigger than the ones she'd seen in economy on previous flights. For a moment, she let herself daydream about how different life could be if first class was a regular thing. Maybe it would mean traveling with her parents more often, seeing places beyond the everyday hustle of their neighborhood and having experiences that felt almost like a dream. Of course, she knew this was a rare treat, and that was part of why she treasured it so much. Outside, morning mist still clung to the edges of the runway. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming passengers and outlining the flight's journey time. Aniyah's heart fluttered with excitement. Cynthia checked her watch, then opened the in-flight menu placed neatly at her seat, eyebrows arching at the promise of a warm breakfast and fresh orange juice. This was a world away from the quick bagels they usually grabbed at a local deli before a flight. Aniyah saw her mother's small smile and couldn't help but feel proud. They were here together, experiencing something that only months ago had felt like a distant fantasy. A passing flight attendant paused briefly to see if they needed anything, offering a kind hello. Aniyah responded with a shy grin, and Cynthia politely thanked her. The sound of the cabin door closing signaled that takeoff was imminent. As the safety demonstration began, Aniyah listened attentively, glancing around at other passengers who had traveled enough times to know the drill by heart. She noticed a few looked her way with mild curiosity, but there was no overt hostility in their expressions, just the mild surprise of seeing a young girl beaming in a first-class seat. In that moment, Aniyah felt a calm anticipation, the kind that comes just before the plane's engines roar. She squeezed her mother's hand again, and Cynthia leaned over to whisper that she loved her and was proud of how hard she'd worked in school. Enough to deserve this treat. Aniyah nodded, soaking up the reassurance. Soon the plane would roll away from the gate, taxi into position, and surge into the sky. For now, the hush of the moment felt like an invitation to hope. Aniyah couldn't predict how the rest of the flight would unfold, or whether her father might appear in some grand, last-minute fashion, but she knew one thing for certain. She was exactly where she was meant to be, sharing this special morning with her mother under that misty New York sky, ready to chase the sunrise to a new horizon. The plane door sealed shut with a subtle pressurized whoosh, and Aniyah felt a gentle jolt as the aircraft pushed away from the gate. In her window seat, she watched the airport scenery slide past, the terminal's glass facades, the luggage, carts scurrying about, and the twisting runway lines that promised a journey west. The morning mist still clung to the edges of the pavement, giving everything beyond the plane's windows a dreamlike blur. It reminded her of how, just moments ago, she'd been standing in the check-in line, feeling half nervous, half thrilled about stepping into first class. Cynthia leaned over to secure Aniyah's seatbelt properly, then checked her own. The faint scent of lavender from her mother's hand lotion mixed with the cool, processed air of the cabin. Aniyah took a second to glance around. A polished metal divider separated first class from the rest of the plane, and she saw a few passengers in business attire settling in. A pair of flight attendants, different from the one they'd briefly encountered upon boarding, walked briskly along the aisle, double-checking seatbelts and overhead compartments. The hush before takeoff felt both cozy and charged with anticipation, as though everyone were silently preparing for a shared adventure. When the safety demonstration began, Aniyah gave it her full attention. She noticed some of the adults barely looked up from their phones, which struck her as odd since she found the process interesting, particularly how each motion of the flight attendants' hands seemed so deliberate. The overhead lights dimmed, slightly to highlight the demonstration. Cynthia's fingers tapped lightly against her armrest, and Aniyah sensed her mother's own blend of excitement and jitters. Out of the corner of her eye, Aniyah spotted a figure moving toward the front. The flight attendant who had greeted them at the door earlier stopped by her row and gave a polite smile, asking if they needed pillows or blankets. Cynthia shook her head and thanked her, satisfied with the level of warmth in the cabin. Aniyah smiled back, relaxing a little more. Everything seemed so pleasant, at least for now. A low rumble from beneath them announced the engines powering up for the taxi to the runway. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom once more, confirming the flight plan and mentioning some turbulence that might occur over the Midwest. Aniyah tried to recall if she had ever experienced turbulence before, but then her attention shifted to the phone Cynthia held in her lap. The screen lit up briefly, displaying a text message from an unknown number, then vanished as quickly as it came. Aniyah leaned closer, curious. Cynthia's lips pressed into a thin line, and she looked slightly puzzled. Before she could investigate further, the plane lurched forward, rolling along the tarmac with a steady rhythm. Aniyah felt a flutter of excitement in her stomach. She was used to traveling in the cramped seats of economy. hearing the rattling carts and busy chatter. In first class, it was like an entirely different world, wider seats, fewer passengers, and a hush that felt almost reverent. She inched forward to catch a glimpse out the window. She could see another aircraft queued in front of them, its tail lights blinking against the greyish morning backdrop. Cynthia placed her phone on airplane mode. She exhaled slowly and gave Aniyah a small, reassuring nod. Aniyah wondered if her father had sent any messages. Perhaps Marcus was still stuck in some last-minute conference call and wouldn't be able to join them after all. She hoped, deep down, that somehow he'd still show up. They had planned this trip for weeks, a short family getaway that would include a couple of museum visits and maybe a theme park if they had time. All these little plans had hinged on the hope that Marcus could clear his schedule. But for now, it was just the two of them, mother and daughter, sharing an unspoken acknowledgement that this was already special in its own right. The plane paused near the runway's threshold, waiting for final clearance. Aniyah felt a small jolt of adrenaline as she noticed the engines grow louder, their pitch rising in intensity. She glanced at Cynthia, who gave her a reassuring smile before turning her attention to the window herself. It was a moment they had yearned for, sitting side by side in a first-class cabin about to soar across the country. "Thank you for working so hard, Mum," Aniyah whispered, her voice barely audible above the throbbing hum of the engines. Cynthia reached over to squeeze her daughter's hand, her eyes gleaming with pride and emotion. Before Cynthia could respond, the plane roared to life, pushing them back against their seats as it gathered speed down the runway. Aniyah's heart raced with the thrill of lifting off, and within seconds they were cutting through layers of clouds, leaving the foggy airport behind. For several minutes, the climb demanded everyone's quiet attention, and Aniyah felt the pressure in her ears pop. The overhead sign for seatbelts remained lit until the plane leveled out at cruising altitude. When it blinked off, people around them began shifting, rummaging in bags or reclining their seats. Across the aisle, the older gentleman who had tipped his hat earlier perused a magazine. Beyond him, a woman in a prim blazer typed swiftly on a laptop. A bell chimed softly, signaling that the cabin crew would begin in-flight service. A friendly voice announced from the intercom that breakfast would be served, describing a choice between a hot omelette or oatmeal with fresh fruit. Aniyah's eyes lit up at the idea of ordering food mid-flight. It felt luxurious compared to the usual plastic-wrapped snack bag. Cynthia reached into the seat pocket and pulled out the menu to give it a proper read. Suddenly, a different flight attendant stepped into their row, a tablet in hand. Her dark hair was pinned back, and her professional smile revealed just the slightest hint of formality. "Good morning. Can I get you started with something to drink? Coffee, tea, juice?" she asked politely. Cynthia requested coffee, and Aniyah asked for orange juice. As the attendant tapped the order into her tablet, she cast a quick, curious glance their way, as though she were noting something about them. Aniyah wasn't sure if it was merely a polite habit or a fleeting hint of judgment. The moment passed, and the attendant moved on with the same neutral courtesy. Aniyah watched her walk down the aisle and considered the odd tone of that glance. She shook it off, reminding herself that she was just excited and maybe reading into things too much. After all, she was in an environment she hardly knew. Beautiful, yes, but unfamiliar. She decided to brush aside any uneasy thoughts and enjoy the ride with her mum. Cynthia gently adjusted the air nozzle above them, and a cooler puff of air streamed down. She leaned closer to Aniyah, her voice soft. "How are you feeling, honey? Still excited?" Aniyah nodded, tapping her feet lightly against the footrest. "Yeah, it's really nice here." She gave a small giggle, then added, "Almost too nice." Cynthia smiled. "Well, you deserve it. We both do. Let's just relax and have a good flight." Outside the window, the sun began to peak, over a bank of clouds, turning everything a delicate shade of gold. The gentle glow washed over the plane's wing, creating a breathtaking panorama. Aniyah felt a calm that only deepened her gratitude for this moment. She forgot momentarily about the anxious pang that came with her father's absence, or the strange look from the attendant. All she wanted was to savor the dreamlike feeling of being above the clouds with her mother by her side, finally able to share this coveted slice of comfort and hope. A wave of optimism swept through her. Maybe this was just the beginning of something wonderful, a memory that would forever remind her how even small victories could shine brightly when you worked hard enough for them. Shortly after Ania and Cynthia settled in with their drinks, the gentle clinking of cups and trays drifted through the cabin as the attendants worked their way down the aisle. Aniyah was savoring the sweetness of her orange juice, her eyes occasionally flicking to the window to watch the shifting clouds. Cynthia, meanwhile, flipped through the info magazine, alternating between brief glances at her phone's clock and the articles about travel destinations she'd probably never visited before. It felt peaceful, like time had slowed to a gentle lull high above the earth. That momentary calm was interrupted by a slight commotion 2 rows ahead. A middle-aged passenger with a crisp business suit started to complain, his voice low but edged with annoyance. Aniyah couldn't hear the full exchange, but she caught snippets about a missing meal preference. Something about the man's agitated gestures made her shrink back a little in her seat. She realized for the first time that not everyone around them was as pleased or excited to be there as she was. Cynthia appeared to sense Aniyah's discomfort and reached over to give her hand a reassuring pat, silently reminding her daughter that they had done nothing wrong. They deserved to be here too. Just as the man's complaint seemed to settle, a new figure stepped into view, a flight attendant wearing a pristine uniform, her dark hair slicked into a neat bun. There was a certain sharpness to her features that contrasted with the warmth of most other crew members they'd encountered. She held a small notepad in one hand, a tablet in the other, and her eyes swept across the cabin with the precision of someone determined to maintain complete control. Her gaze briefly fell on Cynthia and Aniyah, but moved on without acknowledgement. She seemed more focused on the disgruntled passenger in the row ahead. Even so, the faint tightness in her expression hinted at a tension simmering beneath her polished exterior. Aniyah tried to return her attention to the seatback screen, fiddling with the interactive map that showed their flight path. She noticed it was still early in their journey. A tiny plane icon crawled slowly across the digital landscape, indicating several hours left until they reached Los Angeles. Every so often, her mind drifted back to her father, and she wondered where he was right now. Maybe he was in a taxi, rushing to the airport, or maybe he wouldn't make it at all. She pushed the thought aside, choosing instead to focus on what the flight had to offer. Movies, breakfast, the novelty of being in first class at last. A little while later, the business-suited man finally quieted down. The older gentleman across the aisle returned to reading, and the hum of conversation resumed a more relaxed tone. That was when the same sharp-featured flight attendant circled back, walking methodically through first class with the notepad in hand. She paused by Cynthia and Aniyah's row, her eyes drifting over them in an assessing way. "May I see your boarding passes, please?" she asked, her tone polite on the surface but laced with a formality that felt oddly stiff. Cynthia blinked, carefully placing her magazine on her lap. "Oh, of course," she replied, her voice calm and friendly. She reached into her purse, rummaging for the slim folder where she kept all their documents. Aniyah felt a sudden tightness in her own chest, as if an invisible tension had crept up on them. The attendant, her name tag read Olivia, waited with a practiced patience, but her posture was rigid. She seemed to weigh every movement Cynthia made. As soon as Cynthia handed over the boarding passes, Olivia glanced at them, flipping one corner to double-check the seat assignment. A brief pause followed, and her brow furrowed ever so slightly. "These are your confirmed seats," she asked, looking up just enough to meet Cynthia's gaze. "Yes, I booked them together," Cynthia responded, trying to keep her smile polite. Aniyah noticed her mother's knuckles tighten around the armrest. Olivia's eyes flickered between the seat numbers and the passengers in front of her. "I see," she murmured. For a heartbeat, it felt like she might say more, but instead she simply handed back the boarding passes and offered a curt nod. "Thank you, Mrs. King. Let me know if you need anything." Aniyah noticed that Olivia didn't address her, not even a quick smile for the child. Instead, she pivoted smoothly and moved to the next row. Something about the whole interaction set Aniyah's nerves on edge, as if there was more going on. Beneath Olivia's civil facade, Cynthia slipped the boarding passes back into her folder, exhaling slowly. She offered Aniyah a reassuring look, but Aniyah could sense her mother's slight unease. They tried to brush it off, resuming their quiet activities. An attendant, thankfully not Olivia, came by to deliver breakfast plates. Aniyah delighted. In the neat presentation, scrambled eggs, a small side of sausage, and a piece of toast with a dollop of jam. Cynthia took a careful sip of her coffee before placing it on the tray, thanking the crew member. Despite the cozy moment of sharing a meal at 30,000 feet, a subtle undercurrent of tension lingered. It wasn't open hostility, nor was it anything that other passengers seemed to notice. But for Cynthia, and even for Aniyah, the subtle shift in someone's tone or an unintended lingering glance often spoke volumes. Trying to break the uneasy silence, Aniyah said, "The eggs taste really good, Mom. I like how fresh everything is." She smiled, though she couldn't quite banish the anxious feeling in her stomach. Cynthia returned the smile and gently brushed a crumb from the corner of Aniyah's mouth. "They do, don't they?" "Let's enjoy," Cynthia replied. There was a moment of motherly warmth there, a small bubble of normalcy that overshadowed any concern. The rest of the cabin appeared largely content. Silverware softly clinked against porcelain, and some of the more seasoned flyers began adjusting their seats into recline mode, probably settling in for a mid-flight nap. Yet every now and then, Aniyah spotted Olivia making her rounds, her gaze occasionally drifting back to them. It was never more than a second's glance, but it felt weighty, like a question left hanging in the air. Did these two truly belong here? Aniyah did her best to ignore it, focusing on the gentle voice of her mother, discussing the sights they'd visit in Los Angeles. Maybe they would go to a kid-friendly museum, or explore a park, or even stop by a famous burger joint she had seen on TV. By the time they finished eating, the flight attendants arrived to clear trays, and the overhead lights dimmed to create a restful atmosphere. Still, in the back of Aniyah's mind, the flicker of doubt Olivia's demeanor had sparked refused to go away. She glanced at Cynthia, wondering if her mother felt it too. But Cynthia kept her calm composure, her tone light as she flipped through the movie options for them to watch together. Aniyah tried to refocus on the simple joy of watching a family-friendly film while suspended in the sky, hoping the subtle tension they'd just sensed was nothing more than a fleeting moment. The cabin lights dimmed further, casting a soft glow over the gently humming aircraft. Aniyah tugged her thin airplane blanket closer to her chest as she settled in to watch an animated movie alongside her mother Cynthia. The laughter of cartoon characters momentarily chased away the unease that had snaked through their earlier meal. With the trays cleared and most passengers absorbed in personal screens or dozing off, the atmosphere felt almost serene. Except for the subtle tension neither mother nor daughter dared to voice aloud. A short while into the movie, Aniyah's tension wavered. She found herself replaying Olivia's curt request for their boarding passes, the way the flight attendant's gaze had lingered a beat too long, as though searching for a reason to doubt them. Aniyah glanced sidelong at Cynthia, who was trying her best to appear relaxed. Her mother's eyes flicked to the seatback monitor, but her posture was a touch too stiff, hinting that she was just as unsettled beneath her calm exterior. Cynthia paused the movie, lightly pressing a fingertip to the screen. "You want me to get you another juice, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice warm but subdued. When Aniyah shook her head, Cynthia exhaled, folding one hand over the other in her lap. "Let me know if you change your mind. Maybe I'll ask for water in a bit." "Okay," Aniyah replied. She mustered a small smile and tried to immerse herself back in the colourful world dancing across the screen. Despite the whimsical soundtrack in her headphones, she couldn't quite shut out the nagging awareness that Olivia hadn't disappeared. Every few minutes, the flight attendant's polished shoes clicked softly up and down the aisle, sometimes stopping to check in on other first-class passengers with a veneer of warmth. Whenever she passed Cynthia and Aniyah, it was as if an invisible shield came down, a silent, terse acknowledgement that they were there, but not welcomed in quite the same way. Eventually, Cynthia pressed pause again and signaled that she was going to head to the restroom. Aniyah nodded, slipping off her headphones and letting the half-watched scene fade into the background. She watched her mother walk carefully through the aisle, hoping the short break might help Cynthia clear her head. Left alone in her seat, Aniyah felt a trickle of uncertainty. She noticed a couple of other travelers in first class casting curious glances, but none seemed overtly hostile. Perhaps they were just bored, idly people-watching. Seconds stretched. Out in quiet expectancy, Aniyah decided she might as well take a look at the flight map. She tapped on the screen, switching from the movie to the little plane icon hovering over the country. They had already crossed several states, and a sense of wonder filled her at how quickly they were hurtling through the sky from the east coast toward the promise of sunshine out west. Yet that fleeting sense of excitement couldn't fully mask the subtle dread that Olivia's presence had sparked. Just then, a pair of footsteps halted beside Aniyah's row. She glanced up to see Olivia standing there, tablet in hand again. "Everything all right, miss?" The question was delivered politely, but the tone was brittle. Without Cynthia's reassuring presence, Aniyah found herself feeling smaller in the oversized seat. "Yes, ma'am," she replied softly, trying to keep her voice steady. Olivia surveyed the empty seat next to Aniyah as though it were some sort of clue. "Is your mother coming back soon?" Her eyebrows rose slightly, conveying an unspoken question Aniyah couldn't quite pinpoint. "She just went to the restroom," Aniyah answered, her own brows knit in a fleeting moment of confusion. It seemed an odd query for the attendant to make. Olivia nodded, tucking the tablet against her side. For a moment she opened her mouth as if to say more, but closed it again in silence. Instead, she offered a stiff smile and stepped away, continuing. Onto another row. Aniyah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Even though Olivia hadn't been overtly rude, the tension in her body left behind a sense of uneasy relief as she departed. Cynthia returned a few minutes later, carefully navigating around a passenger in the aisle who was stretching. She settled back into her seat, smoothing her skirt with a practiced motion. Aniyah noticed the slight pinch in her mother's expression as she glanced around the cabin. "Did I miss anything?" Cynthia asked lightly, forcing a bright note into her voice. Aniyah shook her head. "Not really," she said, her tone equally subdued. She wanted to tell Cynthia about Olivia's brief inquisition, but something in her gut told her it would only add to her mother's worries. Instead, she pressed play on the movie again, hoping to cloak herself in its harmless fantasy for a few more minutes. Cynthia placed her hand over Aniyah's on the armrest, the simple gesture radiating warmth and reassurance. The airplane shuddered, gently as it hit a patch of mild turbulence, but neither Cynthia nor Aniyah flinched. Their minds were too occupied with a different kind of unrest, one that had nothing to do with air pockets or bumpy skies. They exchanged a glance, a shared acknowledgement that the friction they felt in this plush cabin seat was more than just physical. It was the weight of unwelcome scrutiny, of a question that neither of them quite knew how to answer. Do we really belong here? Somewhere behind them, the persistent click-click of Olivia's heels approached again, but this time it drifted into an adjacent cabin area. For the moment at least, they had a pocket of peace. Cynthia angled her screen to resume. The movie with Aniyah, pulling the blanket up to both of their laps. The whimsical soundtrack returned, its cheerful melodies filling their headsets. Aniyah exhaled softly, letting herself be lulled by the bright colors and friendly voices, trying to forget the anxious edge that tinged this otherwise remarkable flight. High above the clouds, everything should have felt limitless. But the unspoken question hung in the air like a leaden weight. Why did acceptance in this luxurious space feel so conditional? They might not have the answers yet, but for now, mother and daughter chose to find comfort in each other's presence, valiantly pressing. Play on a moment of borrowed calm. The overhead lights flickered momentarily, and a hush rippled through the first-class cabin as though everyone sensed a shift. Outside, the view of distant clouds and pale sunlight had faded, leaving only a charcoal sky streaked with the faintest hints of orange. Turbulence nudged the plane in uneven intervals, but Aniyah felt each bump more acutely in her nerves than in her seat. Despite the relative calm just an hour before, something felt like it was brewing, an invisible weight pressing against the atmosphere inside the plane. Cynthia switched off the screen after the movie's credits rolled, rubbing her eyes as if to clear away the unease. Aniyah glanced at her mother's profile in the dim lighting. She noticed the subtle tension clinging to Cynthia's brow, and she wondered if her mom had been able to enjoy the film at all, or if her thoughts had been on Olivia's distant footsteps and those watchful eyes that never seemed to leave them. "For long, it's getting dark out," Aniyah murmured, lifting the window shade a fraction. She caught sight of the plane's wingtip shuddering in a gust, lightning flickering somewhere off in the distance. Although the weather forecast had hinted at storms over parts of the Midwest, she hadn't expected to see it firsthand. She turned to Cynthia for reassurance, and her mother managed a gentle smile. "We'll be fine, honey," Cynthia said, reaching for Aniyah's hand. "It's just a little turbulence. Let's see if we can maybe get some rest before we land." Aniyah nodded, though sleeping on planes had never come easy to her. She still felt a mix of wonder and apprehension, especially with the lingering tension from Olivia's repeated intrusions. As if on cue, the overhead speaker crackled, and a smooth pilot's voice announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting a bit of weather on our route. The seatbelt sign will remain on for a while. Please stay in your seats when possible." While Cynthia busied herself tucking away the remains of their blanket and adjusting her seat, Aniyah's gaze wandered across the aisle. An older gentleman, the same one who had politely nodded at them earlier, was quietly reading a hardcover novel beneath a dim reading light. Something in his calm, unhurried demeanor was reassuring. Maybe not everyone here was scrutinizing them. Maybe he even had a granddaughter Aniyah's age. She allowed herself that small comfort. A sudden jolt shook the plane harder this time, causing a chorus of startled gasps. A set of overhead bins rattled ominously, and for a brief moment the entire cabin seemed suspended in collective breath. Aniyah swallowed, her stomach flipping. She felt Cynthia's hand slide protectively over hers in a gesture of solidarity. But the tension wasn't just from the weather. It was as though everyone was bracing for any unexpected disruption, whether from the storm outside or the muted unease inside. The cabin lights flickered again, this time accompanied by a fresh wave of turbulence that set plastic cups trembling. On tray tables, one passenger, evidently rattled by the sudden shift, buzzed for a flight attendant. Instead of Olivia, a different attendant arrived, her smile genuine but edged with concern. She reassured the passenger in hushed tones, carefully. helping them reposition an overhead bag that threatened to slip. From her seat, Aniyah could hear the tremor in the attendant's voice as she tried to stay composed. It struck Aniyah that, for all their polished uniforms and poised manners, the crew were also human, dealing with the same jarring flights and unexpected weather as everyone else. She appreciated that this attendant seemed kind, a stark contrast to the reserve and occasional frostiness Olivia had shown them. Time felt slow and thick, the minutes rolling on in near silence, broken only by the hum of engines and the subdued rattling when the plane hit another pocket of rough air. Aniyah realized she had been squeezing her mother's hand too tight and eased her grip. She tried to focus on steady, even breathing. A memory flickered, her father teaching her a simple, calming exercise. Inhale to a count of 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4. He had always had a calming presence, and she missed him keenly in that moment. A rustle at the front of the cabin drew her attention. From the corner of her eye, she spotted Olivia stepping through the curtain, separating first class from the galley. Even from a distance, the flight attendant's posture was rigid, her expression set in an almost mechanical efficiency as she handed off a stack of folded blankets to another crew member. Aniyah had the faint impression of being watched, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck that made her wish the lighting were bright enough to confirm or dispel that suspicion. Cynthia must have sensed the shift in Aniyah's mood, because, she whispered, "Try to relax. We'll be on the ground soon enough, and I'm sure your dad will meet us at the hotel if he can." Aniyah nodded, though she couldn't shake the uneasy swirl of emotions. It felt as if each new pocket of turbulence echoed the unspoken question that loomed in her mind. What was it about them that made someone like Olivia so wary, so guarded? The older gentleman across the aisle suddenly closed his book and rose slightly from his seat, possibly intending to stretch or head to the lavatory. A fresh jolt of the plane made him stagger, and Cynthia instinctively extended a hand in concern. He steadied himself with a courteous tip of the head, mumbled a thanks, and carefully eased back into his seat when the cockpit announced once more that the seatbelt sign would remain illuminated. He glanced in Cynthia's direction, a silent nod passing between them, as though to say, "We're all in this together." Outside, lightning cast a brief glow across the wing, and thunder seemed to roll soundlessly at such high altitude. The plane felt small against the magnitude of the clouds beyond. Yet inside, for Cynthia and Aniyah, the cabin was enormous with possibilities, some hopeful, some unsettling. The morning excitement they had felt while boarding seemed far away. Now, all they could do was ride out the subtle storm swirling, both outside in the weather and within these luxurious high-altitude walls. The question of belonging still hung unanswered in the pressurized air, but mother and daughter held fast to each other, determined not to let a few bumps, literal or otherwise, throw them off course. The aircraft trembled again as another pocket of turbulence swept over them, and Aniyah felt her heart thud once more. She squeezed Cynthia's hand on impulse. The cabin lights dimmed briefly, then returned to their usual soft glow. Despite the modern comfort of first class, the plane seemed like a small raft tossed on an uncertain sea. Most passengers kept to themselves, heads down, reading lights on, or eyes closed in restless sleep. Aniyah's ears caught a faint chime from her mother's phone in the seat pocket, though it was locked and in airplane mode. She watched Cynthia fish it out, only to realize it wasn't a new message but a reminder for some meeting or appointment back home. Cynthia sighed, set the phone aside, and patted Aniyah's knee. "This flight feels longer than it is," she murmured, her voice gentle over the engine's steady drone. Aniyah nodded, thinking again of her dad. Marcus was supposed to join them, but who knew where he was at this point? She imagined him pacing, in an office somewhere, or maybe racing to another airport gate, trying to catch a connecting flight. The mental image gave her a flicker of hope. Perhaps he'd appear in a surprising twist once they landed in Los Angeles, before she could dwell too long on that daydream. A quiet bustle toward the front of the cabin caught her attention. Olivia stood by a senior flight attendant, the two of them locked in hushed conversation. Though Aniyah couldn't make out their words, she noticed Olivia's lips thin into a firm line, as though in disagreement. The other attendant, taller, and with graying hair at her temples, gestured calmly with her hands, attempting to maintain composure. After a tense moment, Olivia exhaled, gave a quick nod, and turned away. The older attendant stayed put, her gaze following Olivia's retreat, concern etched across her features. A small knot tightened in Aniyah's stomach. She recognized the older attendant's expression. It reminded her of teachers back in school, who noticed something off, but couldn't quite figure out how to fix it. It was the look of someone who wanted to help, but felt constrained by rules and hierarchy. Aniyah's eyes flicked to Cynthia, wondering if her mother had noticed the exchange. Sure enough, Cynthia wore that same slightly troubled look, as though each new sign pointed to a deeper tension that neither mother nor daughter fully understood. Cynthia leaned in and whispered, "Honey, I know you sense what's going on. There's some friction with that flight attendant. Olivia, it might be nothing, or maybe she's having a rough day. Don't let it ruin ours, okay?" She squeezed Aniyah's shoulder gently, attempting a reassuring smile. "We'll handle whatever comes our way." Aniyah nodded, not entirely convinced, yet she didn't want to worry her mum by voicing all her concerns. With a shaky breath, she tried to refocus on simpler, happier thoughts, like how good the warm towels felt earlier, or the taste of fresh orange juice they'd been served. If she clung to those small joys, perhaps the rest could fade into background noise. The cabin speakers crackled, and the pilot announced that they'd altered course slightly to dodge the worst of the storm cells. Aniyah glanced through the window again and glimpsed the faint glow of city lights below, shimmering like a distant galaxy. The turbulence was easing, but an unspoken tension remained aloft, tangling with the recycled cabin air. At last, the seatbelt sign flicked off. Several passengers used the break in turbulence to stretch their legs. A tall woman in elegant business attire made her way forward, and a man with a southwestern accent inquired about whether he could get a glass of water. Aniyah braced herself, half expecting Olivia to appear and conduct another round of suspicious questions, but instead it was the older flight attendant from earlier who approached with a pitcher of water and plastic cups. She paused near Cynthia and Aniyah, offering a kind smile. "Everything all right here?" she asked gently, her tone without pretense. Cynthia thanked her and requested a cup for each of them. Aniyah found herself relaxing in the woman's presence. There was warmth in her eyes, like she genuinely cared about the well-being of everyone on board. She poured the water carefully, handing each of them a cup. Aniyah sipped gratefully, the coolness soothing the dryness in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. A flicker of amusement lit the attendant's face. "You're welcome," she replied. "We'll be out of this rough patch soon enough." Her voice was confident, yet she didn't deny the unease lingering in the cabin. She seemed to sense there was more at play than just bumpy air, but she didn't pry. She moved on to the next row, leaving a gentler atmosphere in her wake. Cynthia set her water on the tray table and gently patted Aniyah's back. "See," she said quietly, "most people are kind. That's what we hang on to, even when a few others aren't." Aniyah nodded, letting her mother's words sink in. Perhaps it was true. Maybe Olivia's guarded attitude wouldn't matter in the long run. They were, after all, paying passengers who had every right to be here. Yet a small, unrelenting voice in Aniyah's mind kept asking, "Why does she keep looking at us like we don't belong?" A faint shuffle of steps brought Olivia back into the aisle. Aniyah tensed, preparing for another uncomfortable moment, but Olivia simply passed by without Stopping, her gaze directed purposefully ahead. The plane swayed gently, and a rustling sound came from somewhere near the galley. For one fleeting second, Olivia's eyes flicked towards Cynthia and Aniyah, then darted away as she turned a corner, vanishing from sight once more. Aniyah let out a breath she'd been unconsciously holding. Maybe Olivia had taken the senior attendant's advice to heart, deciding to leave them in peace. She exchanged a look with Cynthia, who seemed more resolved now, as though bracing for the final stretch of the flight. Whatever unpleasantness hovered unspoken between them and the flight attendant, it felt like Cynthia was determined not to let it overshadow the rest of their experience. The mild turbulence returned off and on for the next quarter hour, but the tension in Aniyah's chest ebbed slightly with each passing minute. She closed her eyes, imagining the moment they'd land in Los Angeles. She pictured stepping out into fresh air, feeling the warmth of late afternoon sun, and scanning the crowd for a glimpse of her dad's broad smile. That hope, as simple as it was, felt like an anchor, a small but steady spark against the background. Of a stranger's doubt, Cynthia reached for Aniyah's hand again, giving it a light squeeze. Neither spoke, but in the hush of the cabin, amid the drone of engines and the occasional flash of seatbelt lights, the message was clear. They had each other. And for now, that was enough. Even under clouds of doubt, love and resilience gave them courage to face whatever awaited when they touched solid ground. Somewhere over the vast American heartland, the plane glided into smoother air, leaving the turbulence behind. The seatbelt sign clicked off with a small ding, and a subtle collective sigh spread through the cabin, as if everyone finally felt comfortable enough to loosen their shoulders. Outside the window, an endless sprawl of farmland and small towns appeared as patches of dim lights dotting a largely dark canvas. Aniyah tilted her head against the seat, her exhaustion growing. She stared blankly at her monitor, where the flight map showed a tiny jet icon creeping closer to the west coast. Cynthia offered a soft suggestion that they both try to doze, or at least rest their eyes. It was late enough that the cabin lights had been dimmed to encourage sleep, and a hush had settled over most of the passengers. A few reading lamps glowed, but otherwise the space was cloaked in an intimate twilight. Just as Aniyah was about to curl up under the thin blanket, she noticed a flicker of movement from the corner of her eye. Olivia appeared again, moving with that same collected efficiency down the aisle. Her dark hair, still impeccable, framed a face that betrayed very little except for a faint tension in her jaw. Aniyah closed her eyes, hoping not to be drawn into another silent interrogation. Maybe if she looked like she was asleep, Olivia would keep moving. A few seats ahead, the older gentleman with the hardcover novel tried to flag Olivia's attention, likely needing something as simple as a refill of water. Olivia paused by him, but her posture indicated reluctance, as though her thoughts were elsewhere. She nodded curtly at his request and disappeared into the galley, returning with a bottle of water and a small plastic cup. Aniyah watched her, feeling something akin to pity. Olivia looked frazzled in a way she hadn't before, and it made Aniyah wonder if perhaps her demeanor wasn't solely directed at them. Could she be dealing with something personal, or was it just the day's challenges stacking up? Nonetheless, the unsettled vibe hadn't gone away. Even with her eyes closed, Aniyah could sense the quiet tension whenever Olivia passed. Cynthia must have felt it too, because she let out a near-silent sigh, shifting in her seat as though fighting the urge to say something. The mother-daughter pair tried to settle into a light rest, their heads angled toward each other for comfort, but the sense of watchfulness remained. At some point, Aniyah couldn't be certain how much time had passed. She became aware of a hushed conversation, a row or two behind them. Two passengers were talking, and though their voices were low, the cabin's stillness made their words more audible. One of them, a woman with a lilting southern accent, whispered something about that little girl and her mother. Aniyah's stomach fluttered, certain they were the subject of that subtle commentary. The second voice, firmer, responded with a quiet but clear undertone of disapproval. "They have first-class tickets, same as the rest of us. I don't see why it's any of our business." Aniyah's cheeks grew warm. She didn't want to eavesdrop, but she couldn't help hearing. She winced inwardly, wishing she could vanish under her blanket. Was this the reason Olivia kept hovering? Some unspoken divide over who belonged and who didn't? She slowly opened, her eyes catching Cynthia's anxious glance. Even though Cynthia hadn't heard the exact words, it seemed she sensed the atmosphere shift again. Aniyah gave a slight shake of her head to convey that it was nothing worth reacting to out loud. Better to maintain their dignity, she thought, than to feed into speculation. Cynthia leaned in, her voice barely above a breath. "We're almost there," she whispered. "Try to hold on. If you're too stressed, we can talk, okay?" Aniyah nodded. There were so many things she wanted to ask. Why people acted like this, why Olivia singled them out, and why a simple flight in first class felt fraught with assumptions. But she stayed quiet. The hush of the cabin encouraged her to keep her worries tucked away until they landed, as though speaking them now might break open the fragile peace they clung to. Gradually, she let her gaze drift across the aisle. She recognized a few faces. The business-suited traveler who had complained earlier now dozed with an eye mask on. The older gentleman was engrossed in his book once more, and a kindly middle-aged woman in a floral blouse had a knitting project in her lap. Aniyah noticed the woman's gentle smile when she looked up and met Aniyah's eyes. There was a comforting nod there, a tiny gesture that signaled empathy, maybe even acceptance. It soothed some of the tightness in Aniyah's chest. Olivia re-emerged once again from the galley, this time accompanied by the senior flight attendant who had handed out water earlier. They spoke in hushed tones, but from the senior attendant's calm gestures, Aniyah guessed it was some sort of briefing on the remaining flight schedule. The senior attendant looked toward Ania and Cynthia's row, her expression neutral, then turned back to Olivia and said something that made Olivia's lips press into a thin line. Moments later, they parted ways, Olivia stepping toward the back of first class, the senior attendant heading to the front. Aniyah couldn't shake the impression that something was about to happen, as though a line was being drawn behind the scenes. She glanced again at Cynthia, who let out another quiet, measured breath. The cabin lights remained dim, the hush returning, like a thick blanket draped over every row. Outside, a few stars emerged in the night sky, twinkling faintly. At this altitude, the plane sometimes felt isolated from the world below, nearly timeless, floating in a space between departure and destination. Yet Aniyah was acutely aware that they were moving inevitably forward. Soon, they would land in California, step off this plane, and leave whatever cloud of doubt they'd encountered behind. She hoped that on the ground, all that tension might dissipate into the wide open air, where she could see her dad rushing to greet them, maybe with a big grin and outstretched arms, unburdened by the invisible walls they'd faced up here. But as the aircraft rumbled softly, and as Olivia's footsteps once more approached, Aniyah felt that the moment of calm might be fleeting, a temporary truce in a conflict yet to fully play out. Darkness weighed heavily over the cabin now, the windows revealing only the faint glimmer of distant city lights far below. Aniyah's eyelids drooped in tiredness, but her mind stayed alert, keyed in to every faint creak of the airplane and every soft footstep in the aisle. She sensed movement again. Footsteps paused near the galley up front, followed by a brief rustle of papers. A murmur of voices drifted back toward her row, low and tense enough that she couldn't pass the words. She glanced across the aisle at the older gentleman with the hardcover, who returned a momentary look of curiosity, as though he too noticed something brewing. Cynthia remained still, leaning back in her seat, eyes closed as if she might be asleep. Yet the steady rhythm of her breathing betrayed a watchfulness beneath her calm exterior, the same way Aniyah remained half awake, half guarded. Despite the cozy recline of the first-class seats, neither mother nor daughter could fully relax. Suddenly, the hush in the cabin broke with a whisper of movement, and Olivia emerged in the aisle. Her uniform was crisp, but her features appeared drawn, shadows outlining the tension in her cheeks. She stopped at Cynthia and Aniyah's row, hugging a tablet to her chest, her posture remarkably stiff. When she spoke, her voice was just loud, enough to pierce the quiet. "Pardon me," she said, and the forced politeness in her tone made Aniyah's stomach tighten. "I need to verify something. Regarding your seating." Cynthia opened her eyes. She inhaled slowly, as if bracing herself, then turned to face Olivia. "We've already shown you our boarding passes," Cynthia replied, keeping her voice calm. "Is there an issue?" Olivia's gaze flicked to Aniyah, then back. "I have to confirm that the seats you're occupying are the ones you purchased," she said, her words a fraction clipped. "These seats are designated for full-fare first-class travelers." A murmur stirred in the row behind them, someone shifting in their seat, craning for a better look. Aniyah felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. Why did Olivia persist in questioning them when she had already checked their passes? Cynthia's breath caught for an instant, but she recovered with measured poise. "We've been through this," she reminded Olivia, pressing her lips into a thin line. "Our tickets are valid. You looked at them earlier." Olivia's eyes remained impassive. "Management requires confirmation," she said, though her explanation sounded more personal than procedural. She held out a hand, tablet balanced on her forearm. "If you could just—" A sharper voice cut across the aisle, startling everyone. "They've already shown their passes to you at least twice." The older gentleman with the hardcover novel lowered his book, meeting Olivia's gaze with a level look. His tone wasn't hostile, but it held clear disapproval. "I'd like to read in peace without hearing more of this, if that's all right." A brief hush fell. Olivia glanced at the man, then to Cynthia, her composure wavering for the first time. She drew in a breath, and her chest rose and fell in a moment of clear frustration, as though she was wrestling with something that wouldn't let her back down. Cynthia held Olivia's stare. Her voice remained steady, though her eyes flashed with hurt. "We have nothing more to prove," she said, reaching for Aniyah's hand in a gesture of reassurance. "We showed our tickets, we've answered your questions. Unless you can give me a specific reason for this intrusion, we'd like to be left alone to finish our flight." Aniyah's heart pounded. She felt both a surge of admiration for her mother and a sting of embarrassment at being the center of attention. She glanced around, noticing how more and more passengers in first class were pausing their own activities to witness the confrontation. Aware of the growing tension, the older flight attendant, the senior one, stepped hurriedly through the curtain from the galley. "What's going on here?" the senior attendant asked, her tone calm but firm as she addressed Olivia. Her gaze flicked between Cynthia, Aniyah, and the subdued anger written across Olivia's face. "Is there an issue I need to handle?" Olivia seemed to stiffen. For a moment it looked like she might argue, but the weight of the cabin's collective attention seemed to press on her. She swallowed, glancing down at her tablet as if searching for authority in its glowing screen. "I was asked to confirm their seat assignments," she managed. "That's all." The senior attendant's eyes shifted to Cynthia. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry for this inconvenience," she said gently. "We do not normally conduct multiple verifications unless there's a system alert. May I see your boarding passes just once more? I promise we won't ask again." Cynthia nodded, though her posture stayed rigid. Carefully, she retrieved the thin folder from her purse and handed it over. Aniyah noticed a tremble in her mother's fingers, whether from anger or nerves, she couldn't tell. The senior attendant scanned the passes on her handheld device. It took only a few seconds before she looked up and returned the documents. With an apologetic shake of her head, "Everything is perfectly in order," she announced. "Thank you for your patience. I'll make sure you're not bothered about this again." A hush settled over the onlookers, and Olivia kept her eyes averted. Aniyah felt a wave of relief mingle with a quiet fury. Why had it come to this? They deserved an apology, not just from the senior attendant, but from Olivia, who seemed unwilling to acknowledge the harm in her suspicions. Cynthia's voice held steady, if a bit hoarse. "That settles it, I hope." She glanced around, her gaze momentarily meeting the older gentleman's, who nodded in solidarity. Then she turned to the senior attendant. "Thank you." Olivia hesitated, lips parted as though she wanted to say something, but whatever words lingered on her tongue never materialized. She pivoted on her heel and walked briskly toward the front of the cabin, tablet clutched tight to her side. The senior attendant offered Cynthia and Aniyah a polite smile before following Olivia, likely to diffuse whatever tension still roiled. Aniyah exhaled, shoulders loosening as she leaned into her mother's side. The other passengers, some looking sympathetic, others merely curious, gradually returned to their magazines, screens, or attempts at sleep. The hush that followed felt charged, like the aftermath of a brief but potent storm. Cynthia placed an arm around Aniyah, and together they reclined slightly, neither speaking but both acutely aware that a fragile boundary had been crossed. They had shown time and again that they belonged in these seats, yet the unspoken question still lingered. Why hadn't that been enough from the beginning? There was no clear answer, only the stinging truth that not everyone was willing to see them as just another mother and daughter excited for a first-class experience. Still, Aniyah felt a glimmer of reassurance in the supportive glance from the older gentleman and in the resolve she saw etched on her mother's face. Even in the pressurized confines of this aircraft, even under suspicious scrutiny, they had remained steadfast. A new calm settled over the cabin. Cynthia whispered that she loved Aniyah, giving her hand a squeeze, and Aniyah nodded, her throat too tight for words. Together they closed their eyes, counting the minutes until the plane would finally touch down, hopeful that the worst of this unexpected turbulence, both literal and otherwise, was behind them. A thick hush filled the first-class cabin after Olivia's abrupt departure, as though the very air had paused in anticipation of what might happen next. Aniyah and Cynthia remained leaning into each other, the shared warmth of their bodies a small shield against the lingering sting of the confrontation. Outside the window, the endless stretch of night sky was yielding to faint streaks of dawn, or so it seemed, given the faint glow at the horizon that hinted at another day just a few hours away. Aniyah couldn't sleep now if she tried. Her heartbeat still pounded from the tension that had soaked the last few minutes. She quietly fiddled with the armrest, letting her gaze wander to the overhead panel, then to the seatback screen that displayed their flight progress. They were nearly 2/3 of the way across the country, the small plane icon inching closer to Los Angeles. It felt surreal that such a mundane image, a miniature plane traversing a digital map, could represent so much relief and longing for solid ground. Cynthia inhaled deeply, a half-meditative gesture that Aniyah recognized as her mother's way of collecting herself. Releasing the breath slowly, she turned to her daughter and offered a reassuring nod. "We're okay," she whispered. "Just keep focusing on where we're headed, not on what's behind us." Aniyah managed a small smile, grateful for Cynthia's steady demeanor. She remembered the older gentleman who had intervened, and she peered across the aisle to see if he was still awake. He caught her eye and gave a gentle affirmative nod, as if to say, "I'm here if you need me." It was a silent reassurance that reminded her not everyone in that cabin saw them as imposters. Gradually, a subdued murmur of conversation spread. In the row behind them, the woman with the soft southern accent leaned over and asked a seatmate if they were near enough to land soon. Someone else clicked off the reading light. A flight attendant, thankfully not Olivia, stepped into view with a carafe of coffee, offering refills to whomever requested it. Life in the cabin, it appeared, was easing back toward normalcy, albeit with a current of curiosity. Aniyah could practically feel the unspoken questions floating around. Had that really just happened? Would it happen again? Half an hour slipped by with no further sign of Olivia. Cynthia allowed herself a moment to unfurl the in-flight magazine, turning pages with an air of forced calm. Aniyah considered pulling up a children's movie again, but she couldn't settle her mind enough to focus on any cartoon storyline. Instead, she watched Cynthia's gaze flit over random articles, airport shopping guides, features on exotic travel destinations they couldn't afford. It felt like a quiet act of defiance, simply enjoying the seats they had rightfully paid for. A mild beep sounded overhead, and the senior attendant, her voice warm and steady, announced they would soon begin descent. People stirred, adjusting their seats upright, preparing trays for collection. Aniyah thought she caught a glimpse of Olivia at the far end of the aisle, speaking in hushed tones with a colleague, her posture noticeably less rigid now. Their conversation remained private, and Aniyah realized she felt no desire to know what they were saying. She'd had enough tension for one flight. As the engine's pitch shifted, signaling a downward path, Cynthia leaned over to Aniyah. "We'll be landing in about 45 minutes, she murmured, brushing a stray curl off her daughter's forehead. "Once we're off this plane, we'll get our bags and go straight to the hotel. Your dad might already be there waiting, or at least on his way." Aniyah's spirits lifted at the mention of her father. She pictured the grin he'd wear, how he'd ruffle her hair and tease her for growing taller every time they met. The thought pushed aside lingering anxiety, replacing it with guarded optimism. She nodded, letting her mother's gentle touch calm the last frayed edges of her nerves. The flight would be over soon enough, and the memory of this stressful journey would fade, maybe not entirely, but at least recede behind more comforting, welcoming images of the days ahead. Cynthia carefully put away the magazine and patted her purse to ensure all their documents were still in place. The older gentleman across the aisle closed his hardcover with an audible snap, stretching his arms with a sigh. Even the fidgety business traveller who had complained earlier seemed settled now, massaging the back of his neck as he gazed toward the front of the cabin. The plane continued its slow, steady descent, and though the air outside was still dark, small lights from the ground grew discernible, perhaps the outskirts of a city or the glimmer of passing highways. Aniyah's pulse, which had been on high alert for what felt like forever, began to ease. She breathed in time with the gentle hum of the engines, allowing the rattle of the landing gear to signal hope rather than dread. With Cynthia's hand resting gently on her shoulder, it finally felt like the end of this tense chapter was in sight. With a subtle tremor, the plane glided through the final descent, dipping below scattered clouds and into the glow of distant city lights. Aniyah peered through the window and saw faint clusters of yellow and white shimmering like fallen stars. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, shoulders finally loosening. Behind her, Cynthia exhaled as well, a barely perceptible sign of relief that they were nearing the end of this strained journey. A rustle of motion spread through first class as the seatbelt sign lit up. Passengers stirred, placing belongings back into bags, raising seatbacks and collecting scattered reading materials. That small flurry of last-minute organization had a comforting routine to it. In the hush between announcements, Aniyah could hear a few people murmuring about hotel reservations, connecting flights, or the day's upcoming meetings. For a moment, it felt like any other flight. Olivia was nowhere in sight. Instead, the senior attendant appeared, calmly instructing passengers to store their tray tables and electronics. Her kind gaze swept the rows, pausing briefly on Ania and Cynthia, as if to confirm that they were all right. Cynthia responded with a small, appreciative nod, and the attendant moved on with a reassuring half-smile. "Are you ready?" Cynthia asked, leaning toward Aniyah. She straightened her daughter's sweater, which had bunched up after hours of sitting. "I think I'll just be glad to get off this plane." Aniyah nodded. "Me too," she whispered back. A swirl of emotions vied for space in her chest. Relief at their approaching arrival, leftover tension from Olivia's scrutiny, and excitement at the prospect of seeing her father in a matter of minutes or hours. She gazed out the window again, spotting an interstate's winding lights. The plane's gentle tilt signaled a final turn toward the runway. The engines roared softly as the landing gear locked into place. Aniyah caught the change in pressure in her ears, and she yawned, letting the mild discomfort pass. Cynthia did the same, a practiced traveler's move. Around them, seatbelts clicked tighter, and the entire cabin hushed as everyone braced for touchdown. When the runway lights appeared below, gliding into view, Aniyah's heart thudded in a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. She wondered if her father had managed to catch a last-minute flight. Maybe he would be waiting at the gate. Though she knew that wasn't how modern airports worked, security rules meant he couldn't come straight to the arrival area. Still, the thought of him standing somewhere beyond the terminal doors filled her with hope. A faint jolt ran through the cabin as wheels connected with concrete, followed by the resonant whine of reverse thrust. The plane decelerated, a collective hush hanging in the air, until a few passengers let out murmurs of relief. Some clapped softly, a gesture that seemed to say, "We made it." Aniyah felt Cynthia's hand on hers, warm and reassuring. The tension in her mother's body seemed to dissipate with each second they taxied along the runway. Once the plane slowed to a crawl, the overhead lights brightened slightly, and the intercom dinged, signaling that it was safe to move about in preparation for disembarking. They sat quietly, waiting for the usual shuffle of standing passengers and overhead bin rummaging to subside. A few rows ahead, the older gentleman who had defended them offered a quick nod and a small wave, as if wishing them well. Aniyah smiled back, grateful for his subtle kindness. It was one of the bright spots in an otherwise tumultuous flight. Only when the cabin door opened and people began to file out did Aniyah notice Olivia again. The flight attendant stood near the front, eyes focused on something outside the aircraft, lips pressed into a tense line. She wasn't greeting passengers or offering farewells with the same enthusiasm as the others. That stance reinforced the uneasy feeling that her attitude hadn't changed. Aniyah hesitated, unsure whether they might have another unpleasant exchange as they exited. Cynthia gave Aniyah's hand a gentle squeeze. "Come on, let's just go," she said softly. They gathered their belongings, purse, carry-on, and the thin folder of documents, and joined the small queue forming in the aisle. It felt strangely intimate to brush past the seats that had borne witness to so much tension, as though part of the plane's memory would forever hold their story. Stepping into the aisle, Aniyah noticed the senior attendant at the door, offering friendly smiles and goodbyes. When Cynthia and Aniyah reached her, she quietly said, "Have a pleasant stay in Los Angeles. Again, I'm sorry for all the inconveniences." Her eyes were sincere, and she offered no excuses, just a hint of regret that lingered in the way. She looked at them. "Thank you for your kindness," Cynthia replied, forcing a polite smile. Then her gaze shifted momentarily to Olivia, whose posture stiffened. "Have a good day," she added, albeit more formally. Olivia mustered a barely perceptible nod, her eyes flicking from Cynthia to Aniyah without any trace of warmth. Aniyah felt a pang of residual hurt, but she swallowed it. The plane was not their home, and the moment was ending. She would rather focus on the fact that they had arrived safely, with their dignity still intact. They stepped through the jet, bridge, the air smelling of rubber matting and industrial cleaner, a sharp contrast to the somewhat stale, pressurized cabin air. Cynthia led the way, glancing down at her phone to see if there were any missed messages from Marcus. The overhead signs pointed them toward baggage claim, and a stream of other passengers joined the flow. Aniyah's pulse quickened with each step, imagining that her father might suddenly appear around a corner. When they finally emerged into the bustling terminal, she could tell from Cynthia's small sigh that Marcus was not there waiting. The airport buzzed with people, some greeting loved ones, others rushing to catch connecting flights. Cynthia moved them to one side, out of the traffic. She fished her phone out and dialed, leaving it on speaker so Aniyah could listen. It rang a few times, then went to voicemail. "Hey Marcus, it's me," Cynthia said. "We just landed. Call me when you can. We'll be heading to the hotel." She ended the call, trying not to look too disappointed. "He's probably still on another flight," she murmured to Aniyah. Aniyah nodded, adjusting her backpack. Her feet felt heavy from the long journey and her shoulders ached, yet there was an undercurrent of relief at being off the plane, standing on solid ground. "Let's get our luggage," she suggested, trying to sound optimistic. With that, they navigated down to the baggage carousel, joining a cluster of fellow travelers from their flight. The older gentleman spotted them from a few feet away and dipped his head in a friendly goodbye. Farther down, the business traveler was already walking off at a brisk pace, rolling his suitcase behind him. Cynthia and Aniyah stood patiently, waiting for the rumbling conveyor belt to deliver their suitcases, each lost in thoughts about the flight and the unresolved tension they'd left behind. In the bright lights of the arrivals area, it almost felt like a bad dream. The unpleasantness, condensed into a sealed tin can, 30,000 feet in the sky. Aniyah breathed in the more open air, letting a small smile curve her lips. They had made it. Marcus or not, they were in Los Angeles, ready to turn a new page. The memory of those watchful eyes, those intrusive questions, would fade with time. Or, so she hoped. She glanced at Cynthia, whose phone buzzed with a text message. Her mother's face lit up, and though it wasn't from Marcus, it was an update about their hotel room being ready for early check-in. Aniyah set her sights on the near future. Maybe, once they checked into the hotel, they could find a sunny spot by the pool, sip some lemonade, and remember that they deserved this trip. Quiet relief washed over them both as their suitcases finally appeared, sliding down the carousel's metal slope. With each step away from the baggage claim, it felt as though they were shedding the last vestiges of the flight's tension, heading into the California morning with hope in their hearts. Sunlight broke through the windows of the arrivals hall, casting long beams across the polished floor as Cynthia and Aniyah wheeled their suitcases away from the baggage carousel. Outside, palm trees gently swayed in the bright California morning, a sharp contrast to the cold, overcast air they'd left behind in New York. Aniyah blinked against the sudden brightness, inhaling the unfamiliar city smell of car exhaust, sea breeze, and sweet warmth. They navigated through the bustling crowd, keeping a lookout for any sign of Marcus. A small, unrealistic hope still glimmered in Aniyah's mind that he might show up at the last minute, calling her name as he rushed forward with open arms. But all she saw were groups of tourists jostling with luggage, business travelers briskly, checking their phones, and weary families shepherding yawning children. No sight of her father. Cynthia's phone screen remained stubbornly blank. She glanced at it again as they reached a quieter corridor near the exit, then sighed, slipping it into her purse. "Still nothing," she said softly. "He might be mid-flight, or his phone could be dead." Aniyah nodded. She tried to muster a bright smile, but her heart quivered with a flicker of disappointment. "We'll see him soon," she replied, echoing the words she wanted to believe were true. They followed signs to a line of taxis waiting at the curb, stepping out into the crisp morning air. The palm trees glimmered in the sun, each gust of breeze rustling their fronds in gentle waves. Aniyah paused, letting her suitcase rest against the curb, and briefly closed her eyes. Perhaps to soak in this new environment, perhaps to push aside any lingering heaviness from the flight. She felt Cynthia's warm hand on her shoulder, guiding her forward. Once they'd stowed their luggage in the trunk, they settled into the back seat of a taxi. The driver, an older man with a friendly nod, asked for their destination. Cynthia read out the hotel's address. The car eased into traffic, the dashboard radio playing a soft jazz tune that filled the silence. Skyscrapers and billboards began to replace the airport scenery, painting the city around them as a realm of possibilities. Yet Cynthia and Aniyah both wore thoughtful expressions, haunted by recent memories and new uncertainties. Even as they took in the sights, glimpses of the flight intruded on Aniyah's thoughts. Olivia's tense posture, the senior attendant's apologies, the curious or sympathetic eyes of fellow passengers. She wondered if any of them were still thinking about her and her mother in that first-class section. Would Olivia chalk up her suspicion to a bad day, or was it something deeper left unspoken? The notion that they might never find out left an oddly hollow feeling. Perhaps that was the nature of passing encounters. Sometimes questions remained, without any real resolution. Cynthia, too, looked pensive. She drummed her fingers lightly on the taxi door, staring out at the bustling streets. Now and then she stole a glance at her phone, almost willing it to ring with the sound of Marcus's voice. Whenever Aniyah caught the flicker of worry in her mother's eyes, she swallowed her own questions and tried to relax against the car seat. At a red light, the taxi driver glanced in the rearview mirror. "Visiting family or business?" he asked congenially. Cynthia smiled politely. "A bit of both," she answered, leaving the details vague. "Hoping to see someone very important to us." The driver nodded knowingly and eased the car forward again when the light turned green. Towering buildings rose on either side of the boulevard. Billboards for new movies and streaming shows flashed by, reminding Aniyah that they were in a city known for reinvention and cinematic illusions. It struck her that this was a place where stories were spun and crafted, but sometimes the real story went untold. When they pulled up to the hotel, Cynthia paid the fare, adding a polite thank you. Bellhops in neat uniforms opened the taxi doors, greeting them with formal courtesy. The lobby sparkled with polished marble floors and large potted plants, a grand chandelier throwing prisms of light across the walls. Cynthia looked down at her phone again, frowning slightly, but she hid the expression as she turned to Aniyah. "All right, let's check in," she said, clearing her throat. They approached the reception desk, where the clerk welcomed them warmly. Their early check-in was confirmed, and soon they were riding an elevator to the 8th floor. The soft whir of machinery mixing with the quiet hum of background music. Their suite was modest but pleasant. A pair of queen beds, a small sitting area, and a view of the city skyline through wide glass windows. Aniyah's footsteps felt heavy as she crossed the carpet to set her suitcase by the wardrobe. She glanced out at the panorama, rooftops stretching into the hazy horizon, dotted with palm trees and signs advertising coffee shops, theaters, and eateries. The place felt alive, but a curl of unease still twisted in her stomach. Was her dad somewhere in that endless sprawl, or en route, or still stuck in another airport? Cynthia set her purse on the dresser and sank onto the bed nearest the window. "Maybe he'll call soon," she said, attempting a light tone. She patted the bed beside her, inviting Aniyah to sit. "We can rest a bit. Maybe go out later and explore." Aniyah eased down next to her mother and tried to share her optimism. They exchanged a faint smile, the kind that said, "We're trying," even if neither felt entirely certain. The flight was over, but questions lingered. How would Marcus respond to hearing about their experience? Would he be angry, disappointed, or would he brush it off as one more instance of ignorance they had to navigate? A soft ding signaled a message on Cynthia's phone, and they both jumped slightly. Cynthia grabbed the device, scanning the screen. Her shoulders slumped. "It's just the hotel manager confirming our check-in details," she murmured. But the disappointment on her face was plain. Aniyah pressed her lips together in a quiet show of empathy. Sometimes the hardest part was the waiting, the not knowing whether everything was really all right. She recalled how she used to wait for her Dad's calls when he traveled, a mix of excitement and nervousness in her stomach. Now that same feeling was back, only amplified by the knowledge that their family reunion was stuck in limbo. From outside, a faint echo of horns blaring and city bustle rose to the window. Cars and buses streamed along the road, and if Aniyah strained her ears, she could hear distant snippets of laughter somewhere below. People out there were living their stories, unburdened by unresolved tensions. Meanwhile, she and Cynthia found themselves perched between relief and unease, uncertain how the day, or the reunion, might unfold. Cynthia let out a long breath, meeting Aniyah's gaze. "We'll be okay," she said softly, more of a promise. To herself than an assurance. "Let's freshen up, maybe order some room service for breakfast. If your dad's not here by noon, we'll plan an activity, maybe the museum you wanted to see." Aniyah nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. Yet, a nagging feeling told her that things might not be as simple as sliding into a day of tourism. The echoes of the flight still clung to her thoughts, a gnawing truth that they'd just been reminded how quickly people's judgment could overshadow courtesy and respect. As they each sorted through their suitcases, a fragile calm settled over the room. The air conditioning hummed quietly, and a faint breeze ruffled the curtains, letting in a sliver of California sunshine. Cynthia paused near the window, her expression distant, phone still in hand. Aniyah watched her and felt a pang of sympathy. They were here in Los Angeles, but Marcus was not. Part of her worried that this day might stretch on without him, leaving them alone to navigate their plans. Behind them, the door's security latch hung loose, as though beckoning someone who might never arrive. The phone sat on the dresser in silent expectation. The memory of Olivia's suspicious stare lingered like a bruise that wouldn't fade, an undercurrent of sadness they couldn't quite brush off. And outside, the city teemed with life, none the wiser to the uncertainties. In one small hotel room, after a moment, Aniyah carefully placed her hands on Cynthia's shoulders. "Mom," she said, her voice gentle, "we got this. Dad will call." Her mother nodded but didn't speak, her gaze drifting somewhere beyond the glass, beyond the present moment. In that shared quiet, it was hard not to feel a slight, inexplicable pull, like a corner of the future was waiting to be revealed, yet stubbornly withheld. They were free from the confines of the plane, but questions still hovered. Where was Marcus? Would he ever hear the full story of what happened up there among the clouds? And if so, how would it change things? The phone never rang, and no knock came at the door. Slowly the minutes slipped by, and the California sun rose higher, casting sharper angles of light into the room. Cynthia and Aniyah stayed side by side, caught in that delicate pause where anything might happen, but for now, nothing did. Their story wasn't finished, only paused in the quiet stillness of a new day and a waiting city. Cynthia and Aniyah stepped out of the airport, leaving behind the high-altitude confrontation that had tested their patience, their dignity, and their right to simply exist without suspicion. But as they entered the bustling city of Los Angeles, it became clear. What happened on that flight wasn't just an isolated moment. It was part of a larger story, one that stretched far beyond the walls of an airplane cabin. A story about perception, about who gets questioned and who is assumed to belong, about silent battles fought in everyday spaces where fairness should be unquestioned. Their journey didn't end when they stepped off that plane. It was only the beginning of something deeper. The uneasy glances, the quiet tension, the need to prove themselves again and again, all of it would remain a reminder of the world they lived in. But just as important was the resilience they carried with them, the knowledge that their presence mattered, that their existence didn't require permission, that sometimes just standing firm was an act of defiance in itself. This story is more than just a flight, it's a reflection of the silent struggles so many face. If you were in Ania and Cynthia's place, how would you have handled the moment? Would you have spoken up, remained silent, or fought back in your own way? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and share to help spread awareness. And subscribe for more thought-provoking stories that challenge perspectives and inspire change. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.